All right, so I want to talk to you real quickly about research and paper topics. Um, I want you to choose something that you're interested in, and the whole purpose of doing the journals and the blogs has been to get you thinking. At a critical level, many of you said, "Boy, it was a lot of work to to try to find the connections between the readings and to think at that level." And I think Nabokov would be super happy to hear uh, that you had to work like that, and I'm really happy to hear it as well. It's supposed to be some work. I mean, it's not supposed to be super obvious, but the fruit of that work for you, hopefully, is that you have ideas now, questions, about what you read, about ideas that came up, themes that you detected, that you could explore through some real good academic research, which we're going to look at next week, um, and that you can turn that into a paper project. But I know it can be hard sometimes to begin brainstorming those topics. So just some things that have come up in my face-to-face classes, paper topics that students have done in the past or that they're mulling now. One approach is, of course, to just choose a fairy tale that you're particularly fond of. All the ones that we read for class work very, very well. There are some others that will work really well that we didn't read. So if there's one that you're particularly fond of that wasn't part of our reading, um, you may be able to use that as well. Although I would suggest shooting me an email real quick to make sure that it's not one that's been a problem in the past. Right. If you're interested in a fairy tale, there's a couple of things you can do. The first thing you should do is read as many versions of that fairy tale as you can get hold of. And the Surlaloon will provide you, usually in the ballpark of about 8 to 12 different versions that you can read. And of course, you can always get printed collections of these fairy tales, um, which would be far more extensive usually than what you can find online. But I mean, a half a dozen different versions is fine. Those would be considered primary sources. They are the stories themselves, and any adaptation in any format would be considered a primary source. So, the Disney films or any other movies that have been made, appearances by those fairy tale characters or reiterations of the fairy tale itself in television shows would be perfectly fine to consult. Um, they show up in video games, they show up in comic books, um, children's book format, all kinds of things like that. You want to be as familiar with the story and its variations as you possibly can be. Now, none of this is the research. This is all just thinking about your topic. So if you're interested in a particular fairy tale, Cinderella, for example, you want to consume as much Cinderella as you can. Because things that would be interesting to research and to talk about in your paper would be how the story changes over a period of time, how the story changes as it moves from culture to culture, how the story changes as it moves from medium to medium, that is, from being an oral story to a print text to a movie to a video game, something like that. You wouldn't want to try to do all of these, of course. You'd choose something, but those would be interesting avenues of exploration. So you would need to know. If I'm going to talk about the effect of culture on the story, I need to know when and where each of these versions of the story came from, and I need to be able to say what's changed from one version to the next so that I can assert that it's changed because it moved cultures, something like that. You can also think about the author, the impact the author has. You can think about the impact the audience has as well. If you're not hooked on a particular fairy tale, then you want to think about themes. So one theme that's a popular one is cannibalism. That's come up in a couple of the stories that we've looked at, Hansel and Gretel and Sleeping Beauty, and to a lesser extent, maybe Little Red Riding Hood. Um, Cannibalism shows up in a lot of fairy tales. So it's unpleasant, but it's an interesting theme. And so you could say, I want to explore cannibalism in fairy tales. Why is that such a popular theme? And then you would want to look for as many fairy tales, within reason that you could find that featured cannibalism. Um, and you'd want to start doing research on how cannibalism shows up in different cultures and things like that in the stories. So that'd be, you could go that route. You could look at feminist perspectives. So you could say, I'm interested in how the character of Cinderella changes from Italy to France to Germany to America. And so you would want to consume those texts, read the stories, watch the movies, take some notes, and then you'd want to look for scholarship about feminist scholarship about the representations of women in fairy tales, and you could draw your own conclusions about why the figure has changed the way that she has. Maybe you're interested in Disney specifically, and you want to look at how has Disney changed their approach to fairy tale representations of women or marriage or something like that from their early movies in the 1930s through the 1950s to the movies they've done in the last 10 years. There's been a lot made about the way the Disney princess has changed since the late 1990s. Um, so that would be an interesting thing. Maybe you're interested in fairy tales from a culture that we haven't looked at. And I know some of you have backgrounds in cultures outside the United States, and so or outside of Europe, and that would be fascinating. Look at um, Chinese fairy tales. How are the Chinese antecedents to these European fairy tales different, and what does that say about the culture, right? And that would be an interesting thing to look at. You could even look at how maybe Western fairy tales, European fairy tales, have infiltrated Eastern culture in a way that's different than how Eastern fairy tales have managed to infiltrate Western culture. Why might people in Eastern cultures, for instance, know Western fairy tales when people in Western cultures don't know the Eastern versions of the fairy tales? How does that exchange work? A lot of different things that you can talk about. They can be in and around the fairy tales. You just need to touch on fairy tales and storytelling as a culturally significant act somehow. Um, you can look at visual representations, how the visual representation of the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood has changed um, in the last 200 years or something like that. There's a lot of different stuff you can do. I'm totally open to your very creative ideas about this. So whatever questions you have that you would like to try and find out through research, please make note of those. And um, when you start doing the research, if stuff is not turning up, uh, don't force it. Okay, I mean you should be getting pretty good returns on your research pretty quickly. So if you have topics you want to run past me, please do that. If you're encountering any problems with the research, please talk to me about it. I can help you tweak and tailor your specific interest to make sure that you both get to write about what you want to write about and turn out a productive paper. Because ultimately, having an interesting topic, of course, is wonderful. But if it doesn't produce a paper for you in the end, then you're going to be in trouble as far as the class is concerned. So, um, but I left it wide open for you because I wanted you to be able to pursue this topic in a direction that interests you, um, so that you're not bored for the next 4 weeks. So let me know how things are going. Stay in touch with me, and if you have questions about topics or want to run topics past me, of course, feel free to do that and run topics past each other as well.